All right, we'll go ahead and get started with today's collaboratory grand rounds. And so today we have a special privilege, really two presentations that will come together in terms of addressing waiver or alteration of informed consent in clinical trials. And so first up, we'll have Lauren Miller from the FDA Office of Clinical Policy, who will give us an update about where things have come from that perspective, that point of view. And then we will have Jonathan Casey and Matt Semler from Vanderbilt to put this in the context of the research landscape. And then hopefully we'll have, as usual, a vibrant discussion of what the considerations are here and how do we apply this in the research world. So first up, we'll turn it over to Lauren, who will introduce herself and what she's been up to with others at FDA and other groups. Lauren, thanks so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Adrian. So as Adrian said, my name is Lauren Milner, and I work in the Office of Clinical Policy in the Office of Commissioner at FDA. For those of you who don't know us, we are the office that's responsible for the FDA policies and regulations related to human subjects protections and IRB requirements. We affectionately call it, it's 21 CFR parts 50 and 56, and they're kind of the rough equivalent to the provisions outlined in the common rule. So I'm here today to talk to you about a rule that we recently finalized that allows for a waiver or alteration for certain types of minimal risk studies that are regulated by us. We're very excited to have this rule in place, and we think it'll help to facilitate minimal risk research that hasn't previously been possible to conduct under FDA regulations, while ensuring that the right safety and welfare of the individuals participating is not compromised. Next slide, please. So how did this all come about? I'm sure many of you know, but just to kind of give you a quick background, I think almost all of you know that the common rule has contained provisions that permit IRBs to waive or alter informed consent for certain minimal risk investigations. And that's been in place for quite a while, since 1991. But FDA and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is, kind of the law for FDA, didn't permit, we didn't have a similar provision. So we do, up until the Cures Act, FDA did allow for a waiver of informed or alteration under certain circumstances, but those are tied to emergency research and kind of other types of research, but not minimal risk research. So in December of 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act was passed, and that law contained two provisions that are relevant to what I'm going to talk to you about today. So the first is Section 3024, which amends the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to provide FDA with the authority to permit an exception from informed consent when the clinical testing poses no more than minimal risk to the human subject and includes appropriate safeguards to protect the rights, welfare, and safety of the human subject. So this is essentially the provision that allows us to provide, to grant a waiver or to incorporate the waiver into our regulations. Another section that's important is Section 3023 of the Cures Act, which directs the HHS Secretary to harmonize, to the extent practicable and consistent with other statutory provisions, the differences between the common rule and FDA regulations. So that's very legalese, but we are in the midst of working on kind of harmonization efforts. And when the rule was enacted, we saw this as a good place, or one of the places that we could think about harmonizing. So next slide, please. 2 years after the rule was enacted, we came out, that was, so in November of 2018, FDA issued the proposed rule to permit IRBs to waive or alter informed consent under certain conditions for these minimal risk clinical investigations. The proposed rule included 4 criteria, the original 4 criteria that have been in the common rule since 1991. This includes that the research, or for us, the clinical investigation, involves no more than minimal risk. It couldn't practically be carried out without a waiver or alteration. It wouldn't adversely affect the rights and welfare of subjects. And when appropriate, the subjects would be provided with additional pertinent information after participation. So these are the original 4. We also, in the proposed rule, requested comment on a 5th criterion, which was aligned with the 5th criterion for the waiver and that was added in the 2010 revisions to the common rule. And so that's specifically about research or clinical investigation using identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens, and discussing how it couldn't be practically be carried out without using that identifiable data or biospecimens. Next slide. We got 46 public comments on the final or on the proposed rule from a variety of groups, including academia, IRB, public advocacy groups, industry and trade organizations, public health organizations, and of course, individual members of the public. The majority of the comments we received were supportive of the rule. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the comments that were most supportive of the rule came from stakeholders that are involved in the conduct of research, like IRBs and investigators and research organizations. About a quarter of the comments directly kind of specified their stated belief that the finalization of this rule would reduce burden on the regulated community by harmonizing our requirements for and can process for a waiver alteration with those of the common rule. And there were also statements that supported the finalization of this rule that discussed how this would, their belief that this would enable the research community to conduct certain kinds of FDA research, which may lead to medical advances or like, for example, in personalized medicine, or potentially better data regarding risks and benefits of drugs and devices in real world settings. I do want to point out, will you go down one more, Mary Jo, for me? There we go. I will point out that a few comments, mostly from individuals of the members of the public, expressed concerns with the rule. Generally, their concerns were about kind of a general belief that waiving consent violates ethical principles and human subjects protections that are afforded by our regulations and U.S. law. And we looked at these comments carefully, and we do provide, very detailed responses to each comment in the preamble. If you want to read it, it is there and ready for your eyeballs. But I think in general, we disagreed with this comments because we do believe that this rule appropriately balances the kind of potential benefits that we might receive from facilitating these kinds of minimal risk research at FDA or under FDA regulation, but also balances ensuring that the right safety and welfare of participants are protected and aren't compromised. We also believe that IRBs and the research community more broadly have been using this for quite some time and have experience kind of with these concepts and with the process. So we think they're well positioned to make some of these decisions for FDA regulated research as well. Next slide, please. So the final rule, which came out in December of 2023, it finalized the 4 criteria that we had initially proposed and formally adopted the 5th criterion, the one that has to do with identifiable data and biospecimens. So this final rule harmonizes this part of our FDA human subjects protection regulations with, kind of the common rule provision. And we believe that there are a number of benefits to implementing this rule. As I stated before, it implements our new statutory authority to permit this exception for minimal risk research, and it also advances our efforts to harmonize to the extent that we can with the common rule. We also do think that this is going to reduce some regulatory burden for stakeholders who are conducting these minimal risk investigations, and we believe that this will promote some healthcare advances that arise from these investigations that couldn't have otherwise been conducted under us, but might kind of help in medical products research or public health research more broadly. Next slide. So what's new here? So since this is harmonized with the common rule, I think for most IRBs and researchers, there is not a whole lot that's new here. It's the same criteria, it's the same process. The rule is relatively new to FDA's regulated community. So as I said previously, before Cures Act was passed, FDA regulations only allowed a waiver and for certain types of research, probably the most well-known being emergency research, but we're not able to waive or alter consent for minimal risk. I say relatively, not entirely, because I will point out that one, obviously there's going to be overlap and some investigations are going to be subject to both sets of regulations. And so those in the research community might very well be familiar with these as it relates to the common rule. Also, FDA did put out a guidance in 2017 that permitted waivers and alterations for minimal risk under enforcement discretion. That guidance was withdrawn when we published the final rule, but because we did have a guidance out for about 6 or 7 years, there's definitely reason to believe that some FDA investigations came in using that enforcement discretion that we allowed in the guidance. But it's very difficult to get those numbers. And so we're not sure to what extent that guidance was leveraged. But again, it's reasonable to believe that a number of people in the FDA regulated community are at least somewhat familiar with this. Again, ultimately, the goal of this rule is to enable the advancement of medical product development by allowing sponsors to use a waiver alteration or investigators for research that couldn't otherwise be conducted. And we're really excited to be here and to see and think about what kind of research we might see as once this rule starts to kind of move forward and be implemented. However, I want to stress, as always, that this is balanced by the need to ensure that we're undertaking research without compromising the rights, safety, and welfare of people that participate in clinical research. And I know at this point in my talk, I sound like a broken record, but I think this point is worth repeating and worth considering. I also know that this is a group that has thought a lot and very deeply about this issue and the issue of ensuring that these rights, safety, and welfare are considered in the context of minimal risk research. So I'm very excited to hear kind of what you have to say to us today. Next slide, please. I do also want to point out, because we've got a number of comments about this, whether or not this changes the definition of minimal risk. And the answer is it does not. The minimal risk definition remains the same as it has been in FDA regulations and in common rule regulations. You can see the citations there. I also want to point out that the concept of minimal risk is not new to the FDA regulated community either. This concept comes up in subpart D of our regulations, research in children. We also have and have for some time allowed a waiver of documentation for informed consent where minimal risk needs to be considered, and of course for our expedited review. So I think while the waiver or alteration of consent is new, the concept of minimal risk isn't, but these additional criteria that need to be met and thinking through what a waiver alteration would look like, these are things that I think will be somewhat new to our community. So next slide, please. So as for next steps, our plan is to develop a draft guidance to accompany the final rule. This is a draft guidance that is being written in response to a number of public comments that requested additional information on or description or our thoughts on the criteria, and also maybe some examples of studies that would or would not meet or be eligible for a waiver or alteration. I can tell you we are actively working on this guidance, and I'm happy to come back and talk more about it once it's published. And then kind of the second thing is really just to communicate with everyone we can, with researchers, IRBs, patient communities, and all other interested parties that this rule is now out, and you know, kind of we're just very excited to hear about kind of all the work that's already being done in this area and thinking about how this is going to mesh with FDA regulated research. So with that said, next slide. I want to thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to hand it over to John and Matt. Or Adrian.
All right, looks like it's working. John, up to you.
Great. So thanks. So again, I'm John Casey. I'm an assistant professor of pulmonary and critical care medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And I direct the coordinating center for the Pragmatic Critical Care Research Group. And along with Matt Semler, we're here today to present a lecture on the waiver or alteration of informed consent in clinical trials, the research landscape. We have funding from the NIH, the Department of Defense, and PCORI, and no conflicts of interest that are relevant to this talk. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we just heard from the FDA about their new guidelines on waiver or alteration of informed consent. And we're here today to talk to the NIH Pragmatic Trials Collaboratory Grand Rounds. And we want to highlight that when thinking about waiver or alteration, that's a broad policy that covers lots of things that we're not going to talk about today, like observational research. And when we think about clinical trials, like those that are supported by the NIH Pragmatic Trials Collaboratory, there's a range of research, much of which involves traditional prospective informed consent. But what we're going to talk about today is where those two things overlap. And we just heard what the FDA final rule is for waiver or alteration of informed consent, and I'll just review those again quickly. So the first criteria is that the clinical investigation involves no more than minimal risk to subjects. The second is that the clinical investigation could not practicably be carried out without the requested waiver or alteration. The third is that if the clinical investigation involves using identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens, the clinical investigation could not practicably be carried out without using such information or biospecimens in identifiable format. The fourth is that the waiver or alteration will not adversely affect the rights and welfare of the subjects. And the fifth is that whenever appropriate, the subjects or legally authorized representatives will be provided with additional pertinent information after participation. And when we're thinking about interventional trials, the two criteria that receive the most attention are the second, that the clinical investigation could not practicably be carried out without the requested waiver or alteration, and the first, that the clinical investigation involves no more than minimal risk to subjects. And we're going to talk about both of those in a little more length. So what did the FDA say in their recent guidance about impracticability? And they spoke a lot by defining what's practicable. They said if scientifically sound research can practicably be carried out using only consenting subjects, FDA believes it should be carried out without involving non-consenting subjects. And when talking about practicable, they provided two examples. They said recruitment of consenting subjects does not bias the science, and the research is not unduly delayed by restricting it to consenting subjects, with unduly delayed being defined as a delay in the initiation of a clinical investigation that is so lengthy as to raise ethical or scientific concerns given the benefit or value potentially gained by the research. And they specifically clarified in a way that I think is really helpful that there may be cases in which getting consent from a subset of individuals in the target study population may be possible, but the study may still be considered impracticable without a waiver. So what does this all mean and how do you operationalize this? I think we can likely, here's our summary of what types of research might be considered impracticable. Those largely fall down into research that's urgent, like emergency and critical care research for which the scale prohibits prospective informed consent, like healthcare system level interventions, or interventions focused on prevention and small treatment effects, where the scale of the research is so large they couldn't be conducted with prospective informed consent. Trials in which prospective informed consent would bias the trial population, intervention adherence, or outcome reporting, and trials in which consent could increase risk to participants. And I'll highlight that there have been ongoing controversies around impracticability, and I think the FDA really addressed a lot of those in this guidance and provided pretty clear guidance. What about waiver of informed consent? So as just described, the FDA regulation used the same the same definition of minimal risk as the OHRP regulations. The probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. And further, they note the waiver is only permitted in circumstances where the risk posed to the subjects by the research are minimal. So what does this mean? To which risk does minimal risk refer? There are at least two types of risk that we could consider. There's the magnitude of risk experience of not participating in the research. So the risk patients are experiencing if they're not in a trial. And those shown here is on the x-axis, so things that are high risk for patients in their daily life are on the far right, and those that are low risk are on the far left. And then separately, there's the independent risk, the magnitude of the risk posed by the research, and that's shown on the y-axis here. Things that are for which the magnitude of the risk posed by the research are high are at the top, and those that are low are at the bottom. So I think we might start by what risk are we not talking about? Minimal risk can't refer to the severity of illness of the patient population being evaluated. Otherwise, observational studies of critically ill patients couldn't be determined to be minimal risk. And we have all seen many chart reviews of conditions like in-hospital cardiac arrest, where everyone agrees the study's minimal risk. Minimal risk can't refer to the risk or side effects of the intervention being evaluated, or observational studies comparing high-risk interventions used in clinical care couldn't be minimal risk. So things like chart reviews of CABG versus stent for coronary artery disease, for which hundreds have been published and been determined to be minimal risk. Minimal risk can't refer to the severity of the outcome being evaluated, or observational studies of important outcomes couldn't be minimal risk. Things like chart reviews on the association between diet and heart attack that are commonly published and considered to be minimal risk. So when we talk about risk, we must be referring to the incremental risk of participating in the research compared to the risk of not participating in the research. So let's think about a couple examples. So patients who are critically ill are at high risk of outcomes whether or not they participate in research. But still, there are independent risks associated with research that would have to be considered. For example, placebo-controlled trial of an experimental drug in a critically ill patient still presents unique independent risk for which no one would propose that trial would be considered to be minimal risk. Even patients who are at low risk of bad outcomes if not participating at research, patients who are at low risk of bad outcomes if not participating in research can still be independently assessed. The risk of research can be independently assessed in those patients. So, for example, if there is a healthy patient who is in a placebo-controlled trial of an experimental drug, even if that drug is a relatively low-risk drug, there are still independent risk associated with that patient such that no one would consider those risks to be minimal. So minimal risk must refer to the probability and magnitude of the risk posed by participating in the research compared to not participating in the research. So a common example that's been used is cluster randomized trials comparing two types of bathing wipes in a hospital. So if patients who are in the hospital are all clean with different types of bathing wipes, if you've got two different types of bathing wipes that hospitals could use and purchase that as far as we know are equivalent, and the patient is going to be exposed to one of those two in routine clinical care, does controlling the choice of those two wipes as part of a research intervention represent more than minimal risk? As noted, public comments address this specifically in the recent FDA guidance, with some in favor and some opposed to the use of waiver for interventional trials, with some going so far as to suggest that waiver should only be allowed for observational research. The FDA responded pretty clearly that we do not agree that a waiver or alteration of informed consent should never be allowed for intervention on human subjects as part of a minimal risk clinical investigation. So under what conditions would interventions on human subjects be considered to be minimal risk? As noted, the FDA is planning to publish guidelines to assist IRBs in applying the criteria for waiver or alteration. I think you might wonder, well, is this the kind of question that they're thinking about and that they're going to address in these guidelines? And I'll highlight this recent editorial in the American Journal of Bioethics from Robert Califf, the FDA commissioner, in which he noted that neither HHS nor FDA regulations currently have guidance on whether or when pragmatic trials might be categorized as minimal risk. These issues need the joint attention of federal agencies, the research community, the healthcare delivery ecosystem, and patient advocates. He went further to note that we lack answers to critical questions about what we should be doing in healthcare and public health practice moving forward on this front, will require a systemic shift toward embedded research and learning healthcare more broadly. So what types of clinical trials have been proposed as being able to be conducted without informed consent before enrollment? It's only those trials in which consent is impracticable and the risk of research are minimal. The types of research for which risk has been proposed to be minimal include comparative effectiveness research, research on processes of care, and decision support. And what types of clinical trials are currently being conducted without informed consent before enrollment? To understand how these regulations are currently being applied, we systematically reviewed all studies meeting the NIH definition of a clinical trial that were published in the last year from May 2023 to April 2024 in the two highest impact clinical journals in the US, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the New England Journal of Medicine. Each trial was reviewed to determine whether informed consent prior to enrollment was required. And to review the results of this systematic review, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Semler.
Thanks, John. I think I want to slow down for just a minute because this has been a very detailed discussion and can feel like it's very hypothetical, right? It has to do with the federal regulations, and we're talking about hypothetically where do trials sit on each of these different standards. The next part of this, I think, should be enjoyable because it makes that tangible and practical. So what we're going to do here is look at the last year at the two highest impact journals in the US and not ask some hypothetical question, but ask today, in the last year, what randomized clinical trials are being conducted without written informed consent prior to enrollment? What are those trials? What are the characteristics of those trials? Are they common or uncommon? What does this look like now? And then think about how should the new FDA final rule impact that going forward. Next slide, John. So here's what we found. So looking back through exactly 1 year of clinical trials, so meeting the NIH definition of a clinical trial, published in one of the two highest impact journals, medical journals in the United States, we found over the year 250 randomized clinical trials that enrolled more than 3 million patients. And of those, there were 217, or 87%, for which written informed consent prior to enrollment was required. And those trials enrolled about 400,000 patients. There were 33 clinical trials, or 13% of all the 250 trials published in that time, where informed consent prior to enrollment was not required. Those trials enrolled more than 3 million patients. So this was striking to me when we saw this, that 90% of the patients enrolled in a trial published in New England Journal or JAMA in the last year were enrolled in a trial that did not require written informed consent prior to enrollment. So 10 times as many patients came from trials that did not require informed consent that came from trials that did require informed consent, which is not necessarily what I would have hypothesized. Next slide. So how did these trials differ? The 87% that required informed consent versus the 13% that did not require informed consent before enrollment. So we already talked about the patient populations being substantially larger in the trials that did not require informed consent. And as you might guess, the majority of trials that did not require informed consent evaluated time-sensitive patient conditions where consent might be more likely to be impracticable. Only 4% of trials requiring informed consent evaluated such conditions. Trials that required informed consent prior to enrollment were much more likely to be evaluating a new drug or a new device in the pre-approval space, whereas trials that did not require informed consent for enrollment, more than 90% of those were comparing approved treatments, comparing the effectiveness of treatments that were already in practice and patients would already be receiving outside of the conduct of research. As you might expect, trials requiring informed consent prior to enrollment that were evaluating these new drugs or devices were more likely to be funded by industry, whereas trials that were not requiring informed consent prior to enrollment were more likely to be federally funded or foundationally funded. So just to summarize that, what are the characteristics of these trials that are not requiring informed consent prior to enrollment? They're more likely to be very large trials. They're more likely to evaluate time-sensitive conditions. They're more likely to compare existing and approved treatments. And they're more likely to be funded federally or foundationally than funded by industry. Next slide. When in these trials that did not require informed consent prior to enrollment, what approaches to informed consent were used? And trials could use more than one. So 60% of these trials used a waiver of informed consent. About 25%, about a quarter of the trials used alteration of informed consent. So verbal consent or to physician consent for a patient who didn't have capacity to provide informed consent. 40% of them involved informed consent after enrollment, so deferred consent or consent to continue the research. And notably, 0 of the trials utilized the exception from informed consent for emergency research, or EFIC, which Lauren mentioned in her talk, as prior to this final rule being the only US FDA approved approach to enrollment in a clinical trial without informed consent. And so this EFIC, which focuses on emergency interventions of life-saving treatments where the research is more than minimal risk, was not used in any of these trials in the last year. Next slide. So what were these trials? This is still all pretty hypothetical sounding. So these are 33 trials published in the JAMA or New England Journal in the last year that did not require informed consent prior to enrollment. And they fell out into basically 3 categories, as far as we could tell. The first of those categories, you might call those where the reason for impracticability was around emergency and critical care. So the condition of the patient or the timing needed for the intervention. And so that was about 60% of all of the trials were in this emergency and critical care space. And they covered the range of what happens in emergency and critical care. So the first examples here are 2 of the trials that were on airway management. Just to make this tangible, this is one of the trials. This was a trial conducted at 17 EDs and ICUs in the United States that enrolled critically ill patients presenting to the ED or ICU with need for placement of a breathing tube, and compared the only 2 devices available in the US to place a breathing tube, the video laryngoscope or a direct laryngoscope. And the outcome was successful intubation on the first attempt. So that's an example of a type of airway management trial in this emergency and critical care space. Next slide. In this emergency critical care space, there was those trials focused on mechanical ventilation or care for patients with acute respiratory illnesses. And you can see some of the questions being asked here. So for a patient on ECMO with severe ARDS, should they be on their front or should they be on their back, supine or prone, right? Should they use a higher oxygen target or a lower oxygen target? And some questions about available drugs like simvastatin or available treatments like convalescent plasma that hadn't been evaluated in the context of COVID-19 infection specifically. So getting a sense of the types of questions that were being asked. Next slide. As you might imagine, in the emergency and critical care space, cardiac critical care was represented. So patients with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, patients with cardiogenic shock or myocardial infarction were represented in these studies. Next slide. Patients experiencing a neurologic emergency or acute trauma. So you can see here randomized trials of patients being treated for acute subdural hematoma, acute stroke, patients with exsanguination or severe hemorrhage. Next slide. And then patients presenting to an emergency department or an intensive care unit in these trials comparing available treatments for severe infection like sepsis. Next slide. And the final 2 in this category were kind of miscellaneous trials that didn't fit very well in one of the other supportive care buckets. Next slide. So to summarize this first, when we're thinking about the 33 trials published in the last year in JAMA or New England Journal that enrolled patients without the requirement for informed consent prior to enrollment, 60% of them, most of them, were randomized trials in emergency and critical care. These were 19 RCTs enrolling more than 15,000 patients, and they had some shared characteristics. These were almost all trials that had randomization at the patient level. In all cases, the informed consent prior to enrollment appeared to be considered impractical because of the urgency of the intervention and the condition of the patient. And notably, none of these trials were conducted with the existing FDA guidance around exception from informed consent for emergency research or EFIC. Next slide. So if 60% of the randomized trials in these journals that were did not require written informed consent before enrollment were these emergency care trials. What's the other 40%? And the next biggest category was 11 of the trials, or 33%, that were these kind of health system level implementation or cluster level interventions. So those were in three categories. The first was cluster level infection prevention intervention. So here's just a tangible example. So this trial in JAMA randomized 233 ICUs in which more than 800,000 patients were cared for, and randomized them to use each of these ICUs was swabbing patients' noses in order to prevent or attempt to prevent the development of Staph aureus infections. So every patient, every ICU was having their nose swabbed. There are two choices for how to do that, iodophor or mupirocin. And this trial randomized the ICUs to either use iodophor or use mupirocin to see if that affected the risk of ICU attributable Staph aureus clinical cultures. So that's an example of an infection prevention trial. You can see others here: decolonization in nursing homes to prevent infection, skin antisepsis before surgery. So that's that first type of cluster level trial. Next slide. Second type of cluster level trial might be described as implementation of either bundles like this Eat, Sleep, Console approach for neonatal opioid withdrawal, or this early detection and treatment of postpartum hemorrhage intervention, or implementation of things that were felt to be potentially best practice that were not yet a part of clinical care in those settings. So cluster level interventions that were evaluating the implementation of bundles or best practices. Next slide. The final type of cluster level trial that was represented were those evaluating approaches to healthcare delivery, screening, or prevention, or population health. You can see some examples here. So this large pragmatic trial in which clinics that care for patients with chronic kidney disease were randomized to either this EHR bundle that was trying to implement best practices and personalized SCKD care to prevent hospitalization or usual care, or this trial across the Kaiser Permanente Northern California system in which the two types of influenza vaccine that were available to the health system were distributed to clinics in a way that allowed evaluation of which of those would result in better outcomes for these patients under 65 years of age. Those sorts of cluster level health system, population health type questions. Next slide. So what can we summarize about this middle category of these cluster level trials? So these were 11 randomized trials that enrolled almost 3 million patients together. They all had in common that the level of the intervention was the cluster. It was a hospital unit, a hospital itself, a clinic, or a community. And in these trials, consent was considered impractical. It appeared generally because either the intervention was delivered to a group of patients who are different than those who might experience the outcomes, such as in the infection prevention space, or because the scale of the intervention itself being delivered to a whole hospital or a whole health system, or the scale of the expected treatment effect was just too large to make consent practicable. So you might imagine the comparison of two influenza vaccines, both at a health system level, that expect very small differences in treatment. Next slide, John. So the final category of these trials that did not require written informed consent before enrollment was small, and it was those that evaluated interventions to promote communication and facilitate care. So you can see here some examples. So an intervention to promote communication about goals of care for hospitalized patients with serious illness, an intervention to default toward palliative care consultation for seriously ill hospitalized patients, those types of communication or care focused trials. Next slide. So to summarize what we found in our systematic review, I think over the last year, in these two high-impact general medicine journals published in the United States, we found 250 clinical trials. 87% of those trials did require informed consent prior to enrollment, and those tended to be more likely to be trials that evaluated a new drug or device that was not yet FDA approved or available, and those that were funded by industry, whereas 13% of trials did not require written informed consent prior to enrollment, and those tended to compare existing treatments or evaluate health system interventions. A striking finding to me was the fact that almost 90% of patients in these trials in the last year, more than 3 million patients, were contributed by trials that did not require informed consent prior to enrollment. So this is not a niche issue. This is a very substantial fraction of the research that's determining care for patients in the United States. And these types of trials currently being conducted today without requirement for informed consent before enrollment generally did appear to fall into the overlap that you might have anticipated by what's been proposed previously in terms of the ways in which practicability of consent might arise, like the urgency of the condition for emergency and critical care procedures, the scale of the health system level interventions, and the biases associated with consent and research on clinician decision-making or communication. And fall into that overlap of the Venn diagram also potentially regarding what possible interventions might be considered minimal risk, such as comparative effectiveness research, research on processes of care, and research on decision support. So with that, John, I'll let you summarize, and then I'll look forward to the discussion.
So in summary, upcoming FDA guidance on waiver and alteration of consent could provide the first regulatory guidance for minimal risk interventional research. And while U.S. federal regulators do not currently provide guidance on minimal risk for interventional trials, trials are occurring with waiver and alteration. There have been 33 trials enrolling more than 3 million patients in the last 12 months, published in the New England Journal or JAMA. And these upcoming FDA regulations present an important opportunity for the NIH Collaboratory's goal of facilitating learning healthcare systems capable of using embedded pragmatic trials to improve patient outcomes. And I really do believe that if the upcoming FDA guidance enshrines this kind of research that clearly is being considered to be important in improving patient care, it would facilitate that kind of research, and we would see more of it. I think conversely, it's a threat that if those guidelines are written in a way where they intentionally or unintentionally prevent this kind of research, we can see that people are already operationalizing these criteria to conduct this kind of research. And I think it's possible the FDA guidance could close off that avenue. I want to thank Dr. Milner for being here and talking to us today about the new FDA guidelines and for working on this really important problem. I want to thank the NIH Collaboratory for inviting us to talk about the research landscape. And I want to finally thank our mentees, Eddie Chen, Stephanie DeMasi, Kevin Seitz, and Amelia Muse for helping with this systematic review. We were asked to help crash the party with Dr. Milner's presentation a little late in the game and came up with this idea just about 2 weeks ago. So these guys really helped us crunch through the systematic review in a very short timeline. So I'll turn it over now to Adrian and we'll start the conversation.
All right. All right. Hey, thanks a lot for pulling things together to highlight this. So just quickly, Lauren, a question that came up is just what essentially is next from the FDA regarding release of any further guidance? Any directions or things that you can share here with the...
Yeah, well, I can share that it's under development. And the timeline is really challenging. And depends on a lot of variables. So I don't mean to sound evasive. Hand to heart can tell you we're actively working on it, and it's important for us to, so we're moving through the process and thinking about a lot of these things. And I will let you know as soon as we get it out. Just to be perfectly frank, I doubt this year is possible given just general clearance processes and things like that. But again, I can't speak to it exactly. But like I said, we as part of our preamble, we mentioned a few times in the preamble that we will be providing this guidance. So.
All right. Well, understand. And as the saying goes, it takes a village and sometimes more than one village. And so I know that's the case
Federal government, yeah.
Well, a lot at stake here, so that's important. Just a more general question here in terms of how things have moved along, and I thought it was pretty interesting what you all presented, Jonathan and Matt, about the different types of studies so far. So there's the kind of category of really the emergent studies, where by necessity there were things that everyone has agreed upon in terms of necessity, the urgency, the importance, and so forth. And then there's the other category really around cluster randomized studies. One kind of key element around all this is around this judgment or assessment around risk and so-called minimal risk in certain settings. Can you talk a little more about that issue about minimal risk? It is one of those things that it's clear when you see it, and it's sometimes can be vague. And I'll give you a concrete example here. Like there are a lot of people who treat diabetes with various medications. They have common benefits often in terms of glucose lowering. They may vary in terms of side effects, some of which may be extremely rare. And how does one help judge that so-called minimal risk criteria? So, because on one hand, healthcare systems, payers, they could decide, well, I'm just going to pick two, and I'm just going to use that. Or one could randomize. So, any takers?
I'd be interested to hear Dr. Milner's thought on this as well, but I'll say that you have to meet two criteria to be considered for waiver or alteration, both minimal risk and impracticability. And I think regardless of how you assess risk for a modestly sized study of a non-urgent intervention, if this was a 200-patient study looking at whatever we wanted to look at, then it would be feasible to obtain consent, and you wouldn't consider doing it under waiver. I think if you're talking about healthcare system level studies, and for example, a study where these medications are already being used commonly and they're considered to be equivalent, and a healthcare system is really choosing between these two, I think that might be a case where people could consider choices like that. And there's been an example in the research that we looked at was that cluster randomized trial of 2 flu vaccines. The healthcare system had to buy a flu vaccine, and there were 2 available. They were known to be equivalent. And they were going to arbitrarily decide what was based on what was available or easiest to buy. And instead, they said, let's control this arbitrary variation through an interventional trial and understand what's best for our patients. So I certainly think that there can be arguments, but obviously it depends on the specifics of the intervention and whether that comparison is truly minimal risk, and what the argument is for why the consent would be impracticable.
I would add one thing. So we've talked a lot about regulations, but I think there's also a framework of thinking about this that I think can be helpful, which it's always compared to what, right? And in this case, it's clinical care, and there are decisions that patients have strong preferences about, and clinicians might think have different outcomes for patients. And then there are decisions which the patient isn't making the decision, the clinician isn't making the decision, they have no preferences, and there's a spectrum in between. So asking the question of, in clinical care, is this something where the data is already good enough that the clinicians feel confident most of the time they know the right choice, or where the patients would have a strong preference, even if it's not known which outcomes are best? But for decisions that are being made where you ask the clinician, they say, well, I don't know, I'd love to have research on this, I don't know which of these drugs is best. And you ask the patients and you say, well, these are 2 drugs that are equivalent as far as I'm concerned. That idea of what does it look like now in clinical care can give, I think, some qualitative sense of what is the level of risk. And if there are things that we don't even ask the patient about, that we don't get consent for from the patient in clinical care, if the hospital makes the determination without ever asking the clinicians or the patients, if the insurance makes the determination without asking even the hospital, those are some flags that this is probably not a decision where the patient has a lot of autonomy in clinical care, has a lot of preference to be expressed in clinical care.
All right, good. Lauren, anything else to add at this point?
Yeah, I mean, not much. I think that these are definitely things that we're thinking about as well, although, again, we understand kind of the sensitivity and the complexity of all of this. And as with a lot of things FDA related, the answer is going to be it depends, which I know is not always the most satisfying answer, but the truth is for us, a lot of it depends on the details. The design, the interventions, things of that nature. So I do think that, I think the things that John and Matt said and those types of considerations are kind of really important, and they're kind of things that we're thinking about too. But unfortunately, I don't have any kind of specific guidance on this. Like I said, I think again, we'll be able to suss it out a little bit more, but ultimately, we don't, like I said, we don't have a particular kind of type of research that we consider minimal risk or not minimal risk. And we go kind of with our definition. So.
All right, good. I guess maybe just to kind of further this analogy, just a one more step here. So, and you kind of mentioned this in terms of some examples. Nudge studies are of high interest. How can you nudge behaviors in so-called the right ways? And so those could be lifestyle behaviors. It could be around getting vaccinated, for instance. High interest, and there's some good examples outside the U.S. where there's been progress of trying to get to that. And by necessity, the scale for these things has to be quite large and be able to be easily implemented. Do you consider can those models be extended to other so-called comparative effectiveness questions? And I'm just using diabetes as an example, but it could be any other chronic health condition where there's a series of choices that people have. It may be in the health system's interest to actually promote the cheapest choice, for instance. And I use the health system, not the delivery care, but just the kind of considerations there. But you also may be able to address the comparative benefit to risk and what actually may be even more valuable. Do you see this kind of framework being able to be enabled? I mean, it's almost like asking, two questions at once. Can we actually do randomized trials in the setting to see how to get best choices of something that people agree on? And can you also understand maybe the comparative benefits to a strategy of care that's using drug A versus a strategy of care using drug B? So is that possible with a waiver of consent?
I assume that this question is
Yeah,
at least for me.
yeah.
That's a great question. I think, another question, and what I'm hearing as the first question is this FDA regulated? And I know that's another question that comes up a lot, and that I cannot provide definitive answers for you guys today or maybe ever, but I will say, again, it depends. If we're talking about, I think FDA will traditionally be looking at things that would be, well, obviously, if there's a label change, if somebody is coming in and saying we want to use this for a new indication or change the dose administration or something, then it likely would fall under either our IDE or our IND regulations. So, whether, and again, I can't say whether or not a minimal risk or an waiver or alteration would be appropriate, but I can say that is now an available tool, right? So previously, if you needed an IND, that means you needed informed consent under Part 50, or you needed an exception. So, question one is it FDA regulated? But I think to kind of broadly answer your question, certainly it just depends on what the study is proposing to do, and what kind of the goals are in terms of what you want to do with the product that you're studying.
Right. Okay. Well, that's very helpful, because I think that helps the audience in terms of thinking of pathways here. Matt, you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm mulling over and going back to your question from one before about different diabetes drugs or different antihypertensives. In preparation for this, I reread all of the final rule and its components. And one of the things that struck me as most important in this, which I think we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, so the final rule identifies impracticability, including if it would unduly delay the research. I actually think even vastly more common than that is if it would unduly prevent the research from ever occurring. And what I mean by that is all research of all approved drugs has basically been prevented from occurring because of the scale. So when a new antihypertensive is approved, we don't systematically ask, is it better than the others? The drug companies have no incentive to do that often. And so a new treatment comes to market, and what is most likely to happen is it will never be compared. It won't be delayed. It will never be compared ever,
Right.
and patients will be indefinitely exposed to the risk. So I think in terms of, to me, the moral core of this argument is it's not undue delay. It is the vast majority of the information we need to care for patients and patients need to make the right decisions is never generated. And one of the major barriers to that is the inability to compare approved treatments at the scale that would be needed to understand which treatments work best for which patients.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thoughts here is that how do you enable comparative effectiveness studies that wouldn't otherwise be able to be done? So I have we're going to run out of time here. There are a ton of comments in the chat, but one thing I wanted to get to, which has been discussed in this forum in the past, is that FDA has their purview. And you said, like, hey, if it's a regulated product, then we can certainly help out in terms of addressing it. But there's also guidance from OHRP. Can any of you talk a little bit about those things in terms of how the stars can align with what you're putting out here, and then what may be in other forums such as OHRP.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can tell you that OHRP had, they reviewed the rule before it went out, and we are in communication with them about lots of topics, and we'll continue to communicate with them about this. I think that, our office works very closely with them. I can't tell you exactly what the product of that communication will be, but I wouldn't worry about there being, wildly different narratives coming out of FDA versus OHRP. We will work internally through one mechanism or another to do our best to make sure that we work with OHRP to have as uniform a voice as we can for this.
All right. Well, this is such a, again, broad set of issues here. So I really appreciate you taking us through this. One last question quickly is, especially when we're in the era of AI for anything, and there's a lot of interest about how to use AI methods to improve delivery of care, choices, etc., software as a device. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because I can imagine, say, the critical care setting, like, for example, all sorts of data being generated every day. There's probably an infinite amount of potential applications there. And, is this a setting where we can be more structured to really do the comparative evaluations of these types of tools? Any takers there, Lauren?
So I mean, I will say from a regulatory perspective, not that you'd need to be keeping up with this, but there is a lot of activity at FDA, mainly stemming from the centers on kind of the technicalities of AI ML. And our office is involved in those efforts. I think that, again, thinking there's a lot of different ways to think about AI ML as a product, as a tool in a process. So my short answer, I guess, is yes, we are thinking about that. I can't, again, I can't really speak to its interface with minimal risk research and kind of the conduct, the everything in comparative effectiveness, the comparative effectiveness world. But I will tell you that we're kind of monitoring and looking at that. So it will be important. Like I said, feel free to email me if you have thoughts about that and how it may interface, because that's information that we can consider as we move forward in some of these other efforts.
Great. Well, we're at the end of time here, but I'm sure we'll have you all come back at some points as well to see how things continue to further along. And so, Lauren, Matt, John, I really appreciate you all coming together to talk about this important issue. It does have broad implications and broad potential, and giving some concrete examples of where things have been going. And hopefully everyone can join us for next week's Grand Rounds, where we'll continue to tackle important topics. So thanks all.
Okay. Thanks so much for having me.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.